Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, all the way to ancient Egypt. Forget those fluffy pillows and fancy memory foam. Because in this version of the past, your comfort might just depend on how much beer and bread you've got stored up. We're going to step right into the sandals of an ancient Egyptian, living through the annual cycles of the Nile and the rather unique tax system that kept their mighty civilization humming. Yes, even that patch of land you painstakingly tilled, and the very crops you grew from it. It all, ultimately, was the pharaohs. This divine ownership formed the philosophical bedrock of their entire taxation system. It wasn't about extracting wealth from his subjects. It was about managing the divine resources for the good of everyone, or should they told you. You see, the pharaoh, being a benevolent mostly god king, was responsible for the prosperity and stability of the two lands. For you, the ancient Egyptian, it wasn't about accumulating wealth in a bank account, but about ensuring the continued flow of sustenance, the prosperity of your land, and the eternal glory of your divine ruler. And so, the cycle continued, a testament to a society that found its stability not in abstract currency, but in the tangible bounty of the earth, carefully managed through a system as old and enduring as the Nile itself. And so, as the last grains of ancient Egyptian history settle around you, perhaps you can feel the quiet hum of the universe slowing down, the stories becoming whispers on the wind. The vast granaries are emptying, the scribes have put down their palettes, and even the mighty Nile seems to be drifting into a gentle slumber. Your journey through a world powered by beer and bread is complete. The sun has dipped below the horizon of our shared imagination, taking with it the last vestiges of the day's demands. Your own thoughts, like ancient papyrus scrolls, are unrolling into soft, indistinct shapes. The gentle rhythm of the story has guided you to this peaceful shore, where the line between waking and dreaming blurs. Let any lingering worries dissipate like the morning mist over the desert. The long, slow current of history has carried you far, and now it's time to simply float. Breathe deeply, let your mind drift free, and know that you are safe, here in the quiet space we've built together. The echoes of pharaohs and farmers are fading now, replaced by the soft whisper of silence. Rest easy. And to ensure that prosperity, he needed resources, lots of them. Imagine the scale. Massive temples to appease the gods, sprawling palaces, the upkeep of a burgeoning bureaucracy, and, of course, the grandest projects of all, those enormous pyramids and intricate tombs that still stand today, baffling modern engineers. These weren't built with abstract money or credit. They were built with the sweat of your brow and the tangible output of your fields. So, when the tax collector came knocking, it wasn't just the state demanding its due. It was, in a very real sense, the divine order being fulfilled. History is full of attempts by rulers to legitimize their power, but few did it quite as effectively as the pharaohs, by wrapping their economic demands in a cloak of religious imperative. The system itself was remarkably well organized for its time. It wasn't some haphazard collection of goods. There was a sophisticated administrative apparatus in place, overseen by viziers and an army of scribes. These were the true unsung heroes or villains, depending on your perspective, of the ancient Egyptian economy. They were literate, they were numerate, and they kept meticulous records. Think about it, no computers, no spreadsheets, just papyrus, ink, and an incredible amount of detailed counting. Every field, every granary, every head of cattle was, in theory, accounted for. This allowed the pharaoh's administration to estimate yields and assess what each region, and eventually each household, would. It sounds incredibly efficient, doesn't it? Though, as with any large bureaucracy, you can be sure there were plenty of loopholes and creative accounting happening in the shadows. Historians still debate the true extent of corruption within the system. Wasn't widespread, or mostly localized. The lack of definitive records makes a precise answer elusive. This centralized control wasn't just about collecting goods, it was also about redistribution. When times were tough, or a region faced famine, the surplus from other, more prosperous areas could be sent to alleviate suffering, in theory, anyway. This idea of the state as a giant, benevolent provider, pooling resources and distributing them as needed, was a cornerstone of their economic philosophy. It created a sense of collective responsibility, albeit one where the responsibility for organizing it all fell squarely on the shoulders of the pharaoh and his divine mandate. You were just a cog in this colossal, divinely ordained machine, producing what was required to keep the cosmic order intact. And for your efforts, you got to continue living, ideally with enough beer and bread left over for yourself and your family. It was a tough bargain, but for thousands of years, it worked. So, what exactly was powering this ancient civilization? What was the real currency in a land where coins hadn't even been invented yet? Forget gold doubloons or shiny silver. For you, the backbone of the Egyptian economy, the true hard currency, was barley and wheat. Imagine trying to explain cryptocurrency to someone who thought a good day's work meant a solid pile of grain. That's essentially the inverse of what you're dealing with here. These weren't just foodstuffs. They were the fundamental units of value, the very measure of wealth and status. Think about your daily life. Every morning, you'd wake up knowing that your sustenance, your ability to trade for other goods, and your capacity to pay your taxes all hinged on these two humble grains. Wheat, particularly emmer wheat, was crucial for making bread, that dense, gritty staple that formed the bulk of your diet, and barley. Well, that was the magic ingredient for beer, which, as we'll soon discover, was far more than just a refreshing beverage. This wasn't some niche crop. These were the lifeblood, the alpha and omega of the Egyptian agricultural year. You lived and breathed barley and wheat, and sometimes, literally, you paid asterisk with them. The concept of a money economy as we understand it simply didn't exist for most of ancient Egyptian history. Fair warning, you might realize your modern life is pretty cushy compared to this. Honestly, you might not even make it through the first flood season without a decent grain silo. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, why not drop a comment below? Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Instead, they operated on a system of barter and administered prices. This means that if you wanted to acquire something, say, a new linen tunic or a clay pot, you wouldn't pull out a leather purse filled with coins. Instead, you'd likely offer a certain amount of barley or wheat. The value of goods was often expressed in terms of measures of grain, or sometimes in units of copper. But these copper units weren't coins. They were just standardized weights of metal used for accounting. It's like saying something costs 5 bushels of barley, or 10 copper rings. You still had to physically exchange the barley or the rings. It sounds incredibly cumbersome to our modern minds, doesn't it? Imagine lugging your wallet to the market, which for you was likely a sack of grain. This reliance on grains as the primary form of value meant that harvests were paramount. A good harvest meant prosperity, enough to eat, enough to trade, and enough to pay your dues. A bad harvest, well, that was a disaster, leading to famine, unrest, and often, a lot of very unhappy pharaohs and even unhappier common folk. The stability of the entire society rested on the annual bounty of the Nile-fed fields. Historians have spent countless hours studying the exact exchange rates of various goods in ancient Egypt, trying to piece together how their economy functioned without coinage. It's a fascinating puzzle, and the answers often reveal just how intricate and adaptable their system truly was, even if it feels incredibly alien to us now. The sheer volume of grain that passed through their hands, from the fields to the granaries, from the granaries to the workers, and then back into the economy as payment, is mind-boggling. It underscores just how fundamental these simple crops were to the very existence of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Now, let's talk about something truly essential to your ancient Egyptian life. Something that probably makes a morning coffee look rather trivial: beer. This wasn't just a party drink or something you sip casually on a Friday night. Oh no, beer in ancient Egypt was liquid gold, a dietary staple, a source of calories, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a significant part of your paycheck. Imagine waking up, heading to work, and instead of a digital transfer or a paper check, you receive a clay jar brimming with frothy, thick beer. That was a perfectly normal Tuesday for an Egyptian laborer. Ancient Egyptian beer was quite different from the clear, bubbly lagers we know today. Forget craft breweries and micro IPAs. Their beer was more like a thick, nutritious gruel, closer to a liquid bread. It was made from barley, sometimes wheat, and often contained a lot of sediment. This wasn't a flaw, it was part of its nutritional value. It was packed with calories, vitamins, and minerals, making it a crucial part of the daily diet for everyone, from the lowest laborer to the mightiest pharaoh. Even children drank it, albeit a weaker version. Think of it less as an alcoholic beverage and more as a vital food source, a kind of nutritious, fermented smoothie that kept you going through a long day of pyramid building or field tilling. Historians are still piecing together the exact fermentation processes and recipe, as there seems to have been a vast variety of regional styles, almost like a prehistoric craft beer scene. So, how did this liquid bread become a form of payment? Well, in a society without coinage, and with a surplus of grain from those fertile Nile floods, it made perfect sense. The state, needing to pay its massive workforce, the thousands upon thousands of laborers building temples, digging canals, or serving in the military, simply couldn't hand out bags of raw barley every day. Turning that barley into a more portable, consumable, and even more valuable form like beer was ingenious. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem. You might be working on a grand state project, enduring the scorching sun, and at the end of the day, instead of waiting for a monthly grain ration, you'd receive your daily allowance of beer. This ensured you had immediate sustenance and hydration, crucial for maintaining a productive workforce. This practice tells you a lot about the priorities of the time. Food security was paramount. It's always cool to see how far these whispers of history travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing on the banks of the Nile River, not a ripple inside, just the anticipation. You can feel the air thicken, almost taste the dust. This isn't just a river, it's the very lifeblood of your existence. By paying workers in a readily consumable, nourishing form, the state ensured its populace was fed and functional. It also created a powerful incentive. Work for the pharaoh, and you'll be guaranteed your daily rations of beer and bread. This system fostered a kind of paternalistic relationship between the state and its people, where the pharaoh, through his administrators, literally fed his subjects. And in a land where a bad harvest could mean widespread hunger, that was a pretty compelling offer. The sheer volume of beer produced for this purpose must have been staggering. Imagine the breweries, not quaint little operations, but industrial-scale facilities churning out gallons upon gallons of this fundamental brew. It truly was the unsung hero of the ancient Egyptian economy, flowing through their society, much like the Nile itself flowed through their land. Beyond the liquid sustenance of beer, there was the solid foundation of your diet, the very stuff of life in ancient Egypt, bread. If beer was your daily wages, bread was your constant companion, your primary source of energy, and just like beer, a crucial component of your tax obligation. Imagine a world where your daily bread isn't just a metaphor for survival, but the literal currency that keeps your life running. Ancient Egyptian bread wasn't the soft, fluffy, perfectly sliced loaf you might find in a modern supermarket. Oh no, this was a hearty, often coarse, and probably truth-chippingly tough affair. It was typically made from emmer wheat, ground between stones. And because those stones weren't always perfectly clean, and thus was just a fact of life in the desert, your bread likely contained a fair amount of grit and shine. This explains why dental problems were so common among ancient Egyptians. Their teeth were literally worn down by their daily diet. Historians have analyzed mummified remains and consistently found evidence of severe tooth abrasion, a testament to the grittiness of their staple food. It's a stark reminder that even the most fundamental aspects of daily life can have unexpected long-term consequences. So, how did this gritty, essential loaf fit into the tax system? Just as with beer, quantities of grain, which would then be processed into bread, were a primary form of payment to the state. Your harvest, once collected, was assessed, and a portion of it was marked for the pharaoh's coffers. This grain would then be stored in massive state granaries, ready to be distributed or transformed. When workers were paid, they received rations of grain, which they would then take home to their families to grind and bake into bread. Or, if they were lucky enough to work at a large temple or state project, They might receive already baked bread directly from the massive state bakeries. These bakeries, often adjacent to large complexes, were industrial-scale operations, churning out loaves for armies, priests, and laborers. The importance of bread went beyond mere nutrition. It was symbolic of life itself, often depicted in tomb paintings and offerings to the gods. A good supply of bread meant prosperity, stability, and the pharaoh's favor. The lack of it meant famine, unrest, and potentially the breakdown of social order. The system ensured that the state controlled the means of production for this vital commodity, giving it immense power over the populace. By controlling the flow of grain, and therefore bread, the pharaoh effectively controlled the population's very survival. It was a tangible, unavoidable link between your daily existence and the grand, divine authority of the ruler. You knew, every time you bit into that dense life, that a part of your labor, a part of the earth's bounty, had gone to support the massive infrastructure and divine rituals of your civilization. It wasn't just sustenance, it was a constant, edible reminder of your place within the grand scheme of ancient Egypt. With so much beer and bread flowing through the veins of ancient Egypt, you might be wondering where it all went. Well, that brings us to the beating heart of the state's economic power, the colossal grain warehouses. These weren't just glorified barns. They were architectural marvels, sophisticated logistical hubs, and the ultimate symbol of the pharaoh's wealth and control. For you, an ancient Egyptian, the Nile isn't just a scenic backdrop for hieroglyphs. It's the ultimate landlord, the demanding boss, and the generous provider, who rolled into one colossal, muddy package. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would swell. You'd watch it rise, the water creeping steadily, then rushing with an unstoppable force, submerging the parched land on either side. Imagine stepping inside one of these behemoths, perhaps feeling the cool, dry air after the scorching heat outside, and seeing mountains of golden grain stretching as far as the eye could see. It would be an awe-inspiring, almost overwhelming sight, a tangible manifestation of the Nile's bounty and the collective labor of millions. These granaries were absolutely vital. They served multiple purposes. Firstly, they were the ultimate safety net. In a land utterly dependent on the annual Nile flood, there was always the risk of a low inundation or a pest infestation that could decimate a harvest. By storing vast surpluses during good years, the pharaoh ensured that even in lean times, there would be enough food to prevent widespread famine. This wasn't just altruism, it was pragmatic governance. A fed populace was a stable populace. A hungry populace was a recipe for rebellion and chaos. The ability to hoard and redistribute food was a cornerstone of the pharaoh's authority and the key to maintaining social order for millennia. Historians still marvel at the sheer organizational feat required to manage such vast quantities of perishable goods without modern technology, truly a testament to their administrative genius. Secondly, these granaries were the source of state income and expenditure. From here, grain was dispersed to pay the wages of countless workers, the laborers building those impressive temples and pyramids, the soldiers guarding the borders, the priests tending to the gods, and the vast bureaucracy that kept everything running. It was a massive, centralized bank account, but instead of numbers on a screen, it was tangible, sacks of wheat and barley. When you received your daily rations of beer and bread, you were essentially drawing from this national reserve. The sheer volume of transactions, the constant influx and outflow of grain, required meticulous accounting, which brings us neatly to the next critical player in this economic drama. The design of these granaries was often ingenious, built to minimize spoilage and pest infestation. They varied in design, from circular silos with access from the top to more rectangular structures, but all were built with thick walls and often elevated foundations to protect the precious contents. You might notice the small, strategically placed vents to allow for air circulation, preventing moisture buildup. Some granaries even had ramps leading up to their openings, allowing workers to easily pour in newly threshed grain. For you, the common person, a visit to such a granary, perhaps to deliver your tax quota or collect your rations, would have been a powerful reminder of the state's might and its capacity to sustain life. It was here, in these silent, dusty vaults, that the abstract concept of taxation transformed into a very concrete reality. demonstrating the true scale of the pharaoh's power and the central role that grain played in the ancient Egyptian world. Managing those colossal grain warehouses and tracking who earned what and who received what wasn't a job for just anyone. This brings us to the truly indispensable figures of ancient Egyptian administration, the scribes. These weren't just people who could write. They were the mathematicians, the accountants, the record keepers, and the bureaucrats all rolled into one. Without them, the entire intricate system of taxation, payment, and resource management would have collapsed faster than a sandcastle in the Nile flood. Imagine for a moment trying to run an entire country's economy without a single computer, calculator, or even paper as we know it. You'd need an army of highly trained individuals, dedicated to the painstaking task of recording every single transaction, every harvest yield, every worker's daily ration. That's exactly what the scribes did. They were trained from a young age in specialized schools, mastering the complex system of hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts. This wasn't just about pretty pictures, it was about precision. They learned arithmetic, geometry essential for surveying flood-damaged fields, by the way, and the rigorous methods of administration. It was a tough education, but it offered a pathway to social mobility that few other professions could. Becoming a scribe meant you were set for life, elevated above the manual laborers, respected for your intellect and vital skills. This annual flood, or Akkad as it was known, wasn't a disaster in your eyes. It was a blessing, the very foundation of your agricultural calendar. Without it, you'd simply starve. This isn't some quaint historical detail. It dictates everything. When the waters receded, they left behind a rich, black silt, a natural fertilizer that made the soil incredibly fertile. This was your cue, the signal to get to work. You could even imagine a young boy, perhaps from your own village, dreaming of escaping the fields by holding a brush and palette, aspiring to become one of these esteemed record keepers. Their tools were simple but effective: a wooden palette with cakes of red and black ink, a water pot, and brushes made from rushes. Their canvas was typically papyrus, a precious commodity made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly along the Nile. They would meticulously record everything: the size of your land plot, the estimated yield of your crops, how much grain you paid in taxes, how much beer and bread you received as payment for state work. These records were then compiled into vast ledgers, giving the pharaoh and his viziers an accurate, mostly overview of the kingdom's economic health. Historians often pore over surviving papyri fragments, piecing together a fascinating but incomplete picture of their daily economic lives. The sheer volume of surviving administrative texts, even after millennia, is astonishing and speaks volumes about the importance they placed on detailed record-keeping. One of the curious little tidbits about scribal life is their position in society. While highly respected, they weren't immune to a bit of gentle mockery in literature. There are ancient texts, often written by scribes themselves, that highlight the arduous nature of manual labor, implicitly praising the scribe's comparatively easy life. You read passages describing the endless toil of the farmer or the back-breaking work of the stonemason, subtly reminding everyone why being a scribe was such a desirable profession. It was a subtle form of self-promotion, a quiet pat on their own backs. So, as you stand there, perhaps watching a scribe with his serious expression and his meticulous brushstrokes, you recognize him as a vital cog in the machine, someone who held immense, quiet power over the numbers that defined your life. They were the unsung, slightly smug, data analysts of the ancient world. So, you've tilled your land, watched the Nile recede, and seen your crops flourish under the relentless sun. Now comes the moment of truth for you, the ancient Egyptian commoner, dealing with the tax collectors, or taxli as they might have been thought of in a later context, though their official titles were often related to overseers or scribes of particular districts. These weren't shadowy figures demanding money in dark alleyways. Oh no, they were very much a part of the official state machinery, recognizable and, more often than not, unavoidable. Imagine a sweltering day. You're out in your field, perhaps winnowing your freshly harvested grain, the air thick with dust and the smell of dry straw. Then, in the distance, you see a small group approaching. It's the local overseer, probably accompanied by a couple of assistants, perhaps even a guard or two. just to make sure things go smoothly. There's no escaping them. They know your land, they've probably been tracking its expected yield, and they're here to collect the pharaohs too. For you, this encounter would be a mix of resignation, perhaps a bit of anxiety, and hopefully, a sense of relief if your harvest was good and you could easily meet your quota. Their job was simple in principle, but complex in execution. Assess the amount of grain or other produce you worried and ensure it was transported to the designated collection points or granaries. They were the face of the state's economic power, the direct link between the divine pharaoh and your humble farm. They would measure your fields, estimate your yield, and then calculate your contribution. This often involved quite a bit of negotiation, or at least the appearance of it. You might try to argue that a portion of your field was barren this year, or that pests had taken a larger toll than expected. However, these officials were well versed in such arguments. They had heard them all before. And ultimately, their word, backed by the authority of the pharaoh, was final. Historians still debate the extent to which these local officials could be swayed, or whether bribery was a common practice. While the official texts portray a highly organized and just system, human nature being what it is, it's hard to imagine that some level of informal negotiation or even corruption didn't exist on the ground. The system wasn't entirely heartless. You, along with everyone else, would be out there, plowing and sowing, racing against time to get your crops in before the sun baked the earth hard again. Wheat and barley were your staples, the very backbone of your diet and, as you'll soon discover, your contribution to the mighty pharaoh. Historians still debate the exact mechanisms of water distribution in various regions. Was it all state-controlled, or did local communities have more autonomy? In times of severe drought or widespread famine, the pharaoh might issue decrees reducing tax burdens or even releasing grain from state granaries to feed the starving population. These decisions, however, were entirely at the discretion of the pharaoh and his top officials, not the local tax collector. For the most part, the tax collector's job was to ensure the smooth flow of resources from the productive land to the state's central administration. You, as the taxpayer, would likely be relieved when they finally left, your portion of the harvest secured, and the pharaoh's share on its way. It was an annual ritual, a necessary part of life, ensuring that the wheels of civilization kept turning, powered by your sweat, your grain, and the ever-present shadow of the tax collector. Of course, no system, no matter how divinely ordained or meticulously planned, is entirely foolproof. Even in ancient Egypt, with its rigorous scribes and god-kings, there was always the temptation to bend the rules, to hold a little extra, or to simply avoid your obligation. This brings us to the shadowy, often hushed topic of tax evasion and the rather strange punishments that awaited those who were caught. It turns out, the pharaoh was not amused by creative accounting. Imagine you've had a particularly good harvest, better than the scribes estimated. You might be tempted to hide a few extra bushels of barley in a secret stash, hoping to avoid paying the full tithe. Or perhaps a late-season pest infestation legitimately reduced your yield. But the tax collector, being the stern and unyielding sort, refused to believe you. What then? The historical records, unfortunately, don't give us much insight into the daily machinations of petty evasion by common folk. It's hard to find a papyrus fragment that reads, "Farmer Menkow hid 3 sacks under his bed, busted." But we can infer that human nature hasn't changed much over millennia. There were almost certainly attempts to underreport yields or to smuggle goods that were supposed to go to the state. Historians are still debating the frequency and scale of such activities, often relying on indirect evidence, like the elaborate security measures employed in state granaries. What we do have more evidence for are the consequences for those caught. And these consequences were, shall we say, memorable. For serious offenses, particularly involving the theft of state property which, remember, included much of the nation's grain, punishments could be severe. While we don't often hear about gruesome executions for tax evasion, the penalties often involve corporal punishment, beatings with sticks or rods. Imagine being dragged before a local official, accused of shortchanging the pharaoh, and receiving a public beating. It wasn't just painful, it was deeply humiliating, designed to deter not only you, but also anyone else who witnessed your unfortunate predicament. There are even records describing more extreme measures, such as forced labor in quarries or mines, which were essentially death sentences due to the brutal conditions. Another curious form of punishment could be a forced confession or public shaming. While not physically violent, losing faith in a society as tightly knit as ancient Egypt could be a significant blow. Your reputation was everything, and being branded as someone who cheated the pharaoh, and by extension the gods, would have had lasting social repercussions. It's important to note that the term punishment in ancient Egypt often encompassed a broader range of disciplinary actions than just imprisonment or execution. The goal was usually deterrence and the restoration of order, not necessarily retribution in the modern sense. So, while you might successfully hide a few extra grains one season, the ever-present threat of discovery and a rather uncomfortable public demonstration of justice would likely keep most common folk in line. After all, a few extra bushels probably weren't worth the risk of a public beating or a trip to a faraway quarry. You've heard us mention it before, but it bears repeating. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a living god. This wasn't just a nice title. It was the bedrock upon which the entire ancient Egyptian state, including its tax system, was built. The truth is probably a bit of both, a patchwork of control depending on the era and the specific locale. You'd spend months toiling under the relentless sun, your muscles aching, your skin weathered. The success of your harvest wasn't just about feeding your family. It was about meeting your tax obligation. And these weren't taxes you paid with shiny coins or abstract numbers in a digital ledger. Well, no, you paid in tangible, edible goods. This concept, known as divine kingship, provided the ultimate source of legitimacy for every demand placed upon you, from conscripting your labor for a temple to collecting a portion of your precious grain. It wasn't just a law, it was the will of the gods, and you simply didn't argue with that. Imagine living in a world where the very act of sowing your fields, watching the Nile flood, and then giving a portion of your harvest to the state was imbued with profound religious significance. It wasn't merely an economic transaction, it was a sacred duty, a participation in the maintenance of Mad. Mad was the cosmic order, the divine balance, truth, justice, and harmony that governed the universe. The pharaoh, as the living Horus, the son of Ra, was the earthly guarantor of Mad. If the pharaoh failed, or if the people failed to support him, then Mad would unravel, leading to chaos, famine, and the wrath of the gods. So, when the tax collector came knocking, it wasn't just some bureaucrat. It was, in a sense, an emissary of the divine order, ensuring the very fabric of your world didn't tear apart. This divine justification made the tax system incredibly robust. It wasn't arbitrary, it was ordained. When you paid your taxes in beer and bread, you weren't just supporting the pharaoh's court. You were ensuring the sun continued its journey across the sky, the Nile continued to flood, and the crops continued to grow. This belief system wasn't just for the elite. It permeated all levels of society. You, as a common farmer, would have understood this. Your daily life was intertwined with religious rituals, offerings, and the constant awareness of the God's presence. Refusing to pay your due was not just a crime against the state. It was a sacrilege, a direct affront to the cosmic order and the deities who upheld it. Historians still debate the degree to which this religious legitimization was genuinely believed by all social strata versus being a clever tool of control. It was likely a complex blend, but its effectiveness in maintaining stability for thousands of years is undeniable. This intertwining of religion and taxation also meant that a significant portion of your tax contributions went towards supporting the priesthood and maintaining the vast temple complexes. These temples weren't just places of worship. They were also enormous economic entities, owning vast tracts of land, employing large numbers of people, and receiving substantial portions of the national produce. By contributing to the pharaoh, you were indirectly contributing to the maintenance of the divine cult that were believed to ensure the prosperity of the entire land. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. The pharaoh, through his divine mandate, collected taxes. These taxes supported the religious institutions. The religious institutions, through their rituals, ensured the gods' favor. And the gods' favor, in turn, ensured the Nile's flood and bountiful harvests, thus perpetuating the cycle of taxation. It was a remarkably stable system, perhaps because for you, the average Egyptian, it just felt like the natural, divinely ordained way of things. You simply paid your dues to keep the universe running smoothly. So, you are an ancient Egyptian farmer. Your life, your entire existence, is tethered to the rhythm of the Nile and the relentless cycle of agriculture. We've talked about grand pharaohs and powerful scribes, but let's bring it down to earth, to your dusty fields and calloused hands. Your daily experience was a constant interplay between the immense natural power of the river and the ever-present demands of the state. It was a life of hard labor, punctuated by moments of quiet satisfaction and, of course, the annual reckoning of tax submission. From the moment the floodwaters receded, leaving behind the rich, black soil, your life became a race against time. You'd be out there with your simple plow, perhaps pulled by an ox, turning the damp earth. Then came the sowing, scattering those precious barley and wheat seeds. The sun would beat down, day after day, week after week. Think about it, your taxes were literally growing in the fields around you. It put a very immediate and personal spin on contributing to the state, didn't it? Every grain of wheat, every stalk of barley, represented not just your labor, but a portion destined for the pharaoh's granaries, his armies, his priests, and his grand construction projects. The Nile dictated the rhythm, and that rhythm directly translated into your economic output and, by extension, your tax bill. You tend to your crops, guarding them from birds and pests, knowing that every single stalk was a potential meal, a bit of beer, and a portion of your contribution to the pharaoh. This wasn't abstract work, it was profoundly physical, demanding every ounce of your strength and resilience. The satisfaction of seeing the green shoots emerge, then mature into golden fields, would have been immense, a direct reward for your ceaseless toil. But that satisfaction was always tempered by the knowledge that a significant portion of your bounty wasn't truly yours. The harvest was a communal effort in a way, with a portion destined for the communal good, or at least, the pharaoh's interpretation of it. Once the grain was threshed and winnowed, separating the valuable kernels from the chaff, it was time to prepare for the assessment. You'd likely store your portion in simple mud brick silos or large jars, but the state's share had to be ready for the assessors. This process of assessment and collection could be a source of tension. You might try to subtly influence the measurements, hoping for a slightly lower assessment, while the tax collectors would be vigilant, ensuring the pharaoh received his full due. This was the annual dance between the individual and the state, a quiet struggle over the fruits of the earth. Despite the demands, there was also a pervasive sense of order and routine. Life revolved around these cycles: the flood, the planting, the harvest, the tax collection. It provided a predictable rhythm, a comforting sense of continuity that stretched back generations. You knew your place, you knew your duties, and you understood the consequences of not fulfilling them. While historians debate the nuances of peasant contentment in ancient Egypt, the enduring stability of their civilization suggests that, for the most part, people accepted this arrangement. It was simply the way things were, the price for living in a land blessed by the Nile and protected by the divine pharaoh. And as you watched those boats laden with grain sail away, you could take some small comfort in knowing that your labor, your beer, and your bread were contributing to something far larger and more enduring than yourself. While beer and bread were undeniably the heavy hitters of ancient Egyptian taxation, forming the bulk of what you owed the pharaoh, the system wasn't entirely limited to staple foods. Depending on your region, your social standing, and the specific needs of the state, you might also find yourself contributing other, more specialized or special items as part of your tax burden. This added a layer of complexity and variety to the pharaoh's treasury, moving beyond mere caloric intake to more refined or unique resources. Imagine you live closer to the desert fringes, or perhaps you are part of a community specializing in crafts. Your tax obligation might then include things like livestock, a certain number of cattle, sheep, or goats. These animals weren't just for meat. They were crucial for labor, for wool, and for milk, making them valuable assets to the state, whether for feeding armies or providing resources for temples. If you were a fisherman along the Nile, a portion of your catch, whether dried fish or fresh, could also be demanded. It makes sense, doesn't it? The pharaoh would take what your particular environment and skills produce best. Historians piece together these regional variations from archaeological finds and administrative texts, revealing a surprisingly nuanced and adaptable tax system that understood the diverse economy of ancient Egypt. Beyond basic agricultural products, there were also taxes on manufactured goods or raw materials. If your village specialized in pottery, you might owe a certain number of finished vessels. If you worked in a quarry, a quota of cut stone could be levied. Even valuable minerals like copper or gold, when they began to be extracted in larger quantities, would have a significant portion claimed by the state. This wasn't a universal experience for everyone, of course. The vast majority of the population were farmers. But for those in specialized professions or regions, their specific skills and resources became part of the broader tax landscape. This cyclical reliance on nature made the Egyptians incredibly attuned to their environment, fostering a deep respect for the river that provided so much, yet also demanded so much. The pharaoh, sitting high and mighty in his palace, wasn't just some figurehead. He was, in your ancient Egyptian worldview, literally a living god. This wasn't just a convenient political claim. It was deeply ingrained in the very fabric of your society. And because he was a god, everything belonged to him. One fascinating, if less common, special item involved labor itself, though often tied to periods of the year when agricultural work was less demanding. This wasn't a direct tax in goods, but a tax in time and effort, where you might be conscripted for a certain period to work on state projects like canals, temples, or even pyramid construction. While not beer and bread in the literal sense, it was a crucial contribution to the national economy, fueled by those very same daily rations of beer and bread. The state provided the sustenance, and you provided the muscle. It highlights how the Egyptian tax system was designed to harness all forms of productivity within its realm, from the bounty of the fields to the skilled hands of its craftsmen and the sheer power of its laborers, all to maintain the grandeur and stability of the pharaoh's realm. So, we've journeyed through the fields, the granaries, and the halls of power in ancient Egypt, tracing the path of your hard-earned beer and bread. Ultimately, this unique system of taxation, built on the humble foundations of grain and the divine authority of the pharaoh, wasn't just about filling storehouses. It was about maintaining the incredible balance and stability of one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. It was the glue that held everything together. Think about it. For thousands of years, this society thrived, building monuments that still defy time, developing sophisticated knowledge in astronomy, medicine, and engineering, all without a modern monetary system. How did they do it? A huge part of the answer lies in this incredibly efficient, albeit demanding, system of real goods taxation. By centralizing the collection of vital resources, your surplus crops, the state could then redistribute them to feed its massive workforce, provision its armies, support its priests, and invest in those monumental public works we discussed. It was a giant, ancient welfare state, albeit one where your contribution wasn't optional. Historians often emphasize the role of the Nile and agriculture in Egyptian stability, but the administrative system that managed these resources, particularly through taxation, deserve equal credit for allowing such a complex society to flourish for so long. This system effectively minimized large-scale economic disparities, at least in theory. While wealth certainly existed, and the pharaoh and his elite lived lives of unimaginable luxury compared to yours, the basics of survival, food and water were, in terms of stability, generally available through state distribution. It prevented the kind of mass starvation that could destabilize other early civilizations when harvests failed. The collective pooling of resources, though extracted by divine decree, provided a robust safety net. You contributed your part, and in return, the pharaoh, through his various offices, ensured the functioning of society, the maintenance of cosmic order, and, crucially, your continued access to the essentials of life. Of course, it wasn't a perfect utopia. There were periods of famine, corruption, and social unrest, proving that even a divinely sanctioned system could falter. But the core principles enjoyed, the annual flood, the diligent scribes, the colossal granaries, and your steady contribution of beer and bread, These elements formed a perpetual motion machine that powered ancient Egypt for millennia. It reminds us that fundamental economic principles can be expressed in vastly different ways across cultures and time.